we will discuss rise of nationalism. And see, with this topic, we are entering into the next phase of our national movement. Right. So, when we prepare our modern India, we prepare till this topic and then after that. So, rise of nationalism would be leading to right the freedom and partition. Right. So, when we start discussing rise of nationalism, we generally face a debate. Why this rise of nationalism? It was because of the British stimulus, or it was a reaction to that colonial policies of the British rule. So, there is a theory, stimulus response theory. But most of the scholars suggested that we cannot accept one theory. It was the result of all the factors, and you all know, and you will come to know in world history, that 19th century was a period of nationalism. You will see unification of Italy, unification of Germany, right. So, after French Revolution, after you can say Napoleon, there was rise of nationalism, and of course, country like India was also influenced by those ideas of nationalism. Fine. So, we are going to discuss a topic called rise of nationalism. Rise of nationalism in India, rise of nationalism in India. Fine. And when we prepare rise of nationalism in India, I told you that there is a theory, right, related to stimulus response theory. So, what we can remember that it has been the traditional explanation, theory. So, what we can remember that it has been the traditional explanation, of this rise of nationalism is stimulus, right, right, generated by the British Raj, stimulus generated by British Raj, right. But we are now not accepting this kind of theory, and what we generally now believe, we can add, we believe that Indian nationalism grew partly as a result of colonial policies, partly as a result of colonial policies, and partly as a reaction to colonial policies, right, right. So, partly as a result of colonial policies and partly as a reaction to colonial policies, right. And we believe that Indian nationalism was a product of mix of, right, various factors. Fine. Is it all right? So, they can give you a question related to this process of the rise of nationalism, and probably they can ask you that to what extent British institution, or the created by British institution, created by the British policies, were responsible for the rise of nationalism. So, they generally give you a statement and you have to right, explain that. You have to give your views. So what we have to remember that we cannot reject those institutions. Of course, British economic policy, British administrative policy, British political policies, right, social policies, cultural policies, they created background for this nationalism. But it was more a reaction to those policies, right? Their purpose was not to create nationalism. I hope you are getting that. So when one historian said that Indian nationalism was a child of British Raj, some Indian historians say that this was unwanted child of British Raj. I hope you are getting it, right? So when you have to write this question, you have to consider both opinion, right? So as I said, partly it was the, you can say, result of the colonial policies, and partly, right, it was a reaction to those colonial policies. Fine. Now, what all you have to write when you are discussing how rise of Indian nationalism? One thing you have already, right, I have already told you that this period, what you call 19th century, was an age of nationalism. This you have to consider, age of nationalism. Right. So, of course, when we are discussing this question, rise of Indian national movement or rise of nationalism, you have to understand in the context of what? Worldwide upsurge, of this concept of nationalism. It was the age of nationalism. And in world history, you will come to know that how rise of Italy, rise of Germany, even Greek War of Independence, right? So you have many examples to suggest that it was the age of nationalism. Even in the context of world history also, they can ask you that 19th century is the age of nationalism. So when you are writing answer, one point would be in the context of worldwide upsurge. Second context would be the policies of British rule, right? Political, economic, administrative policies. And because of this policy, try to understand it, because of these policies, there was an understanding of contradiction in Indian and colonial interest. After, you can say, these policies, we came to know that their interest is different, our interest is different. So there was understanding of contradiction in Indian and colonial interest, and that played important role. So we have to discuss this contradiction theory, contradiction theory, right? So when we realize this contradiction, there was rise of nationalism. Then we have to discuss in brief Western education, how it played important role. We have to discuss how press played important role, right? There was different example of press. Then we have to discuss how socio-religious reform movement, you already know, Raja Ram Mohan Roy, Vivekananda, right? They all prepared background for nationalism. And then finally, we have to discuss how those reactionary policies of Lord Lytton and Lord Ripon, right? And because of those reactionary policy, there was reaction and there was rise of nationalism. I hope you are getting the structure. What would be your structure? How you are writing this answer? How rise of, or what led to the rise of national movement or nationalism? You will talk about the worldwide upsurge. You will discuss the policies, how these policy exposed British rule. You will discuss the role of Western education, role of press in arousing consciousness among the Indian. You will discuss the socio-religious reform movement, how it played important role in what? Arousal of nationalism. and you have to discuss policies of Lord Lytton, policies of Lord Ripon, and those reactionary policies, those racial arrogance played important role in rise of nationalism. Is it fine? 5, 6 areas we have to discuss, and when you will discuss this, you will get the answer what led to rise of nationalism. We started thinking in terms of nation. We started thinking in terms of a platform, right, for Indians, for India, and that was the background for foundation of Indian National Congress. So in 1870s, we started thinking in terms of a national institution, a national organization of Indians. Is it fine? Simple development. How rise of nationalism, right? I told you, and it should be in that order, right? And finally, we have to mention reactionary policies of Lord Lytton, 1876 to 80, and Lord Ripon, right? And in Lord Ripon's policy, he was known for those liberal policy, but right, when Lord Ripon introduced, right, what you call, right, very popularly, what you call Ilbert Bill. So that Ilbert Bill controversy finally created background for rise of nationalism or foundation of Indian National Congress. Is it okay? I hope you can manage it, right? So how we are writing, how we would be writing this factors for the rise of Indian nationalism. Number one factor would be what led to the rise of Indian national movement or Indian nationalism. Number one factor you will explain, right? What you will explain, first point, right? Worldwide upsurge of ideals, of nationalistic ideals or ideals of nationalism. Ideals of nationalism. Worldwide upsurge of ideals of nationalism, right? There was worldwide movement in Ireland, Italy, Greece, right? So worldwide movement, worldwide upsurge of ideas of nationalism. This you have to explain. Fine. So 19th century was the age of nationalism. So after French Revolution, you will see a rise of nationalism. Fine. Then second point, then second point, we can add how there was understanding of contradiction, in Indian and colonial interest, understanding of contradiction in Indian and colonial interest, right? And this contradiction was more clear when Dadabhai Naoroji developed drain theory. Who developed this drain theory? Dadabhai Naoroji. Drain theory. Fine. So you will explain worldwide upsurge, you will explain understanding of contradiction in Indian and colonial interest, right? And when you are explaining understanding of contradiction in Indian and colonial interest, you will explain drain theory, that how after drain theory people came to realize that colonial rule was the major cause of India's economic backwardness. We realized that all our problems, poverty or unemployment, is because of this rule, right? British rule. So this contradiction, this understanding was, right, eye opener. It was a game changer. So this helped in the rise of nationalism. Fine. Then third point we will explain how political, right, economic and administrative unification, political, economic and administrative unification helped in the rise of nationalism. How political, economic and administrative unification helped in the rise of nationalism, right. So when we have one civil services, one judiciary, one law, one railway policy, one telegraph policy, one postal policy, and the impact of it. So we started realizing, we started, right, visualizing India, right. So this unity came after this kind of policy. So British, of course, played important role in this kind of unity, administrative, political, economic unity. Our fate got linked, right. So this you have to explain, the third point, right. Then fourth point, why rise of nationalism? Fourth point, we can mention the role of Western education. This is very important. Role of Western education. Role of Western education in the rise of nationalism, right. And how Western education played important role? Because of Western education, progressive ideas, because of Western education, progressive ideas, progressive lesson, right, related to freedom, related to nationalism. Because of Western education, you will see a new class, new middle class emerged, and because of Western education, there was a common language. English emerged as a common language. So unification possible, exchange of ideas possible. Fine. So Western education played important role. Is it fine? Then after Western education, it was third, or it was fourth, okay, right. So we can mention fifth. Fifth idea, what played important role was press, role of press. Press, right, played important role, press played important role in arousing, training, mobilizing and consolidating public opinion, nationalist public opinion. So Bipin Chandra used this expression that played important role in mobilizing and consolidating nationalist public opinion. And we can also add that press made transmission of ideas, less expensive and more universal, right. So press played very important role, and you can give example of different journalists, different press in Hindi, press in Tamil, press in Bengali. Who can forget the name, right? Bankim Chand Chatterjee, Subramanyam Bharati, right? So they all played very important role in the rise of nationalism. This you have to elaborate with some example. Then sixth, or the next factors responsible for rise of nationalism was socio-religious, right, reform movement. reform movement. Socio-religious reform movement. So, socio-religious reform movement, right, how it played important role. You can remember how Raja Ram Mohan Roy or Vivekananda prepared the background. They gave us confidence, they gave us courage, right, they gave us courage to talk about problems, right. And there was rediscovery of India's past, that also, right, you can see, you have to elaborate how because of this reformer there was rediscovery of India's past. And right now, like people like Vivekananda, they created a new picture of the glorious India, right, glory of India's past. And because of this kind of interpretation, elaboration, right, we gained self-respect, we got confidence. So, they played very important role. For example, Dayanand Saraswati, he started saying what? India for the Indians, right. So, this kind of approach helped in the rise of nationalism. So, role of socio-religious reform movement also we have to discuss. Then we can mention that how, and this would be very important point for us, this point would be very important point for us, right. So, we can mention how reactionary policies of British, right, played important role in, right, in rise of nationalism. And here we can talk about Lord Lytton. You have to explain the policies of Lord Lytton. You have to explain the policies of Lord Lytton. What kind of policy? Like we can mention that Lord Lytton provoked Second Anglo-Afghan War. Lord Lytton provoked the Second Anglo-Afghan War, which adversely affected the economic resources of India, right. It was not required, Second Anglo-Afghan War. It was very complex war. British could not handle it, but they wasted our economic resources. So, Lord Lytton provoked Second Anglo-Afghan War, which adversely affected the economic resources of India. So, therefore, reaction, economic situation was not good, and when this war, right, started and result was not favorable, it actually created problem. Then we can also mention Lord Lytton, that he arranged Delhi Darbar. Have you heard about this? Delhi Darbar. He arranged Delhi Darbar, right, to declare Queen Victoria as the, you can say, Empress of India. So, Delhi Darbar, and right, this arrangement of Delhi Darbar was, right, when people were suffering. India was in a grip of famine, right, epidemic. So, journalists started writing, right, about, right, that Nero was fiddling when Rome was burning. Fine. So, Delhi Darbar at this kind of critical period, critical juncture, right, played important role, right, gave rise to reaction. Then we can also mention that his economic policy also created reaction. Lord Lytton's economic policy also Lord Lytton's economic policy also created reaction. He abolished import duties on many articles. He abolished import duties on many articles, and this policy made the import of British articles cheaper into India. So, that was a huge shock for Indian, you can say, producers. So, Indian producers started reacting because import of articles, British articles, made cheaper. Then Lord Lytton, we should remember for his Vernacular Press Act, Vernacular Press Act 1878, Vernacular Press Act 1878, which curbed the liberty of Indian press, which curbed the liberty of Indian press. Very popular, Vernacular Press Act 1878. So journalists started reacting. Then Lord Lytton is also known for his racial discrimination, racial discrimination through the Arms Act, through the Arms Act 1878, right? So Indians not allowed, Europeans allowed, they can keep arms, this kind of discrimination. And Lord Lytton was also known for, you can say, lowering the maximum age for civil services. So 21 to 19. So this also created problem, right? So we have to discuss the reactionary policies of Lord Lytton, right? It created background for nationalism, and 4, 5 these reactionary policies you have to remember. And then we can add Lord Ripon's policy, how he, because of the pressure, he started changing, he started raising the age limit, right? He repealed the Vernacular Press Act, so people were very happy. And then he passed what is called, right, Ilbert Bill 1883, right? So Lord Ripon introduced what you call Ilbert Bill, very important bill, Ilbert Bill. So it was for Indians, no doubt about it. So Ilbert Bill aimed to remove the disparity between Indians and European judges, right? But when he introduced this bill, widespread protest by the Englishmen started, and under pressure, bill was amended. And when this bill was amended, it set a wrong precedent. And Indians now realized that they could not expect any justice or fair play from the English when their own interests were involved. And they realized that there is a need, right, to create a pressure group. There is a need to create an organization of Indians so that they can protect their own interest. So Ilbert Bill finally convinced Indians. Even S.N. Banerjee said that no self-respecting Indians could sit idle under the fierce light of that revelation. So after this kind of exposure, when Ilbert Bill was amended, right, people started, right, you can say, realizing that there is a need of a national organization, right. So these reactionary policy also you will write, Lord Lytton and of course Ilbert Bill. So our answer would be complete, right. So finally, how rise of nationalism? I said how rise of nationalism, worldwide upsurge, understanding of contradiction, political, economic, administrative unification, Western education, role of press, socio-religious reform movement, and reactionary policies and racial arrogance of the British, particularly Lord Lytton. And finally, you have to discuss Ilbert Bill controversy, which prepared the immediate background for foundation of Indian National Congress. The Indian National Congress was formed at Gokul Das Tejpal Sanskrit College in Bombay, right, December 1885. So on 28 December 1885, INC, Indian National Congress, was formed at Gokul Das Tejpal Sanskrit College in Bombay. It was attended by 72 Indian representatives and they included people apparently from various walks of life. Most of them represented what? Middle class, rising middle class, and as one historian suggests that there were 39 lawyers, 14 journalists and even one doctor. As you all know that the first meeting was scheduled to be held in Pune, but due to a plague outbreak there, the meeting was later shifted to Bombay. And A.O. Hume assumed office as General Secretary of the Congress, and W.C. Banerjee, Womesh Chandra Banerjee, right, of Bengal, Calcutta, was elected first president, right. But within a year, the number of delegates gone up to more than 400, 436, and it kept rising steadily, and so this Indian National Congress started playing a dominant role in India's struggle for independence. So, when we prepare this topic called Indian National Congress, which was established in 1885 December, we must know some important facts related to this development. But for our main examination, there is a need to remember different theories regarding formation of Indian National Congress. Is it okay? So, I said Indian National Congress was established in 1885 December, right, and of course, there are some important facts related to this Indian National Congress, but for our main examination, you have to remember two important theories, right, regarding the formation of this Indian National Congress. One theory is popularly called safety valve theory, right. You will see this in your book, in your textbook, safety valve theory. And the second theory is called modern theory. So, there are two theories regarding the formation of Indian National Congress. They can ask you that how it was formed, Indian National Congress formed. They can ask you what was the role of A.O. Hume in Indian National Congress, in the formation of Indian National Congress. They can ask you that do you believe the authenticity of safety valve theory, right. So, this kind of question they can ask you regarding the formation of Indian National Congress, right. And when you understand these two theories, you understand the story behind the formation of Indian National Congress. So, I said there are two theories, safety valve theory and modern theory. When you say safety valve theory, this theory originated from William Wedderburn's biography of A.O. Hume, which was published in 1930. And Wedderburn wrote in 1870s that A.O. Hume, right, had come across 7 volumes of secret reports which showed that there had been seething discontent among the lower classes and a conspiracy to overthrow British rule by force. When A.O. Hume came to know about this, he became disturbed. He met disturbed. He met Lord Dufferin and together they decided to establish Indian National Congress. So, what Wedderburn is trying to suggest, try to understand. Wedderburn is trying to suggest that Indian National Congress was the result of a conspiracy, therefore, safety valve theory, right, is considered also as a conspiracy theory. Wedderburn wanted to suggest that the Congress was in a way, the creation of British rule, and it was because of this combination, Dufferin and Hume combination, which was responsible for the creation of Indian National Congress, right. And this theory was believed by the earlier nationalist historians, it was believed by the imperialist historians and even Marxist historians, but in 1960s criticism started and even Bipin Chandra started highlighting, right, the reality behind this story. And they said, not only Bipin Chandra, many modern historians, they said that all those 7 volumes of secret report cannot be traced. It is not available in India, it is not available in London. So, we will not believe this 7 volumes of secret report. Then the opening up of Lord Dufferin's private papers cleared up the confusion by exploding the myth of Dufferin's sponsorship of the Congress or Hume. Even your modern historian Shekhar Bandhopadhyay made this statement, and because of this we started rejecting this safety valve theory and we started accepting modern theory. So, we do not accept safety valve theory now, we now accept modern theory. And when you analyze modern theory, this theory was related to contribution of Indians, and all the modern historians, they suggest that Indian National Congress was not the British creation, it was Indian creation. It was because of, right, the contribution of Indians. In 19th century, there was a sense of nationalism and groups of educated Indians were politically active in the 3 presidencies, and they started creating many regional organizations, associations. So, we must conceive the foundation of Indian National Congress in the context of associations prior to Indian National Congress. Right. So, in 19th century only you will see many association, and then you can see finally in 1870s and 80s, right, there was a sense of nationalism. We wanted to establish a political platform, national platform, and finally with the help of A.O. Hume, we established Indian National Congress. So, Indian National Congress is not the British creation, it is because of Indian initiative. Here for our preliminary examination, we can remember some important regional organization like the Jamindari Association, which was later renamed Landholder Society, which was established in 1838 by Dwarika Nath Tagore, Prasanna Kumar Tagore, Radha Kant Dev, Ram Kamal Sen, and even Bhavani Charan Mitra. So, this was the beginning. And then the Bengal British India Society was formed in 1843. In 1851, both these organizations were merged to form British India Association of Bengal. Then Bombay Association and Madras Native Association were formed in 1852, And in 1860s there was a great development. Dada Bhai Naroji organized East India Association in London, and first time there was a nationwide agitation against the proposed income tax. This is very important development. What is important here? Nationwide agitation in 1867 against the proposed income tax. So, national consciousness was there in 1860s. In 1870, the Pune Sarvajanik Sabha was founded under the leadership of Justice Ranade. In 1875, Sisir Kumar Ghosh, established Indian League in Bengal, and then in 1876, very important development, Indian Association of Calcutta was founded by Surendranath Banerjee, S.N. Banerjee, and with the foundation of Indian Association, a new phase. In 1877-80, a massive campaign was organized around the demand for Indianization of civil services. There was a national campaign against the notorious Vernacular Press Act of 1878. Then there was a major nationwide agitation, against, you can say, that modification of Ilbert Bill. And it is said that the Surendranath Banerjee even conceived the idea of an all India national conference, and Madras Mahajan Sabha 1884 and Bombay Presidency Association in 1885, they also represented that national consciousness in India in 1880s. So, when you analyze these development, you can easily conclude that in India in 1870s and 80s, formation of a national organization was clearly in the air, but there was still the need for a mediator who could bring all these regional leaders together under one umbrella. And A.O. Hume, a retired civil servant, was ideally suited for this role, and as Shekhar Bandhopadhyay suggested, that his supra-regional identity, remember this, Shekhar Bandhopadhyay suggested that his supra-regional identity made him acceptable to all the regional leaders, and he was also acceptable because of his noble intention, because of his liberal political opinion. He wrote letters to the graduate of Calcutta University. He took the initiative to form an All India organization, and finally, Indian National Congress was established in 1885, because of Indian initiative and with the help of A.O. Hume. So, this is all about modern theory, and we accept modern theory. So, when you prepare this topic, Indian National Congress, what should be your conclusion? Your conclusion should be that Indian National Congress represented the urge of the politically conscious Indians. It was not the result of the conspiracy of some Dufferin and some Hume. Indian National Congress represented the urge of the politically conscious Indians, and as Bipin Chandra concluded, that Indians also used Hume as a lightning conductor. So, now we do not believe safety valve theory, we believe Bipin Chandra's modern analysis, Shekhar Bandhopadhyay's new analysis, and we are calling it modern theory of formation of Indian National Congress. Is this okay? So, when you prepare this topic for civil services examination, what all you have to do? You have to remember some facts related to Indian National Congress. You have to remember safety valve theory, you have to remember modern theory regarding formation of Indian National Congress, right. And we must appreciate the ideas highlighted by Bandhopadhyay, Shekhar Bandhopadhyay when we prepare this topic for our civil services examination, right. Thanks a lot. Be early nationalist. Fine. So, after foundation of Indian National Congress, you all know that those early nationalists we are calling moderates. Moderates. And generally, traditionally, we say that these moderates continued till 1905. Generally, traditionally, we say that this is the age of moderates, and then after that, there was a rise of extremism. There was a rise of extremism. After 1905, there was a rise of extremism. So, we have to understand that how these moderates contributed in our nationalism. What exactly was the approach of this early nationalist? What exactly was the objective of Indian National Congress? Indian National Congress. When it was established, what was this objective? Fine. All those founding fathers, all those people who contributed in the foundation of Indian National Congress, they were called moderates, they were called early nationalists, right. And their objective was to promote and nurture Indian nationhood. Their objective was to politically educate people. Their objective was to present popular demands. Their objective was to formulate a common program to unite people. Fine. Their objective was not Swaraj. Swaraj will become objective, but after 1905. Early nationalists realized their limitations. Their purpose was not to demand Swaraj or to go for Swaraj. Their purpose was, as I said, to promote and nurture Indian nationhood. They wanted to preserve this nationalism. Fine. And because of this kind of approach to preserve nationalism, their approach or their method was, sometime you will see, constitutional method. Their method was soft, gradual, slow method. You can consider this as a weakness. I hope you are getting it. But it was the need of the hour that we have to understand. They will give you again a statement and they will ask you what was the contribution of the early nationalists, what was the contribution of the moderates. Contribution you have to appreciate in the context of these difficult time, where preserving this organization was the ultimate challenge, was the real challenge. Fine. So, what was the method of these early nationalists? First, you have to concentrate on that. What was the method of this early nationalist? Method of this early nationalist. Method, their method was, number one, constitutional agitation. constitutional agitation. Constitutional agitation within the four walls of law, constitutional agitation. We can mention that their approach was slow and gradual, slow and gradual, slow and gradual. Their method was slow and gradual. They believed in orderly, political progress, political progress, orderly political progress. They believed in order. They believed in economics more, less politics, more economics, right? So use of economics, use of economic analysis, discussing budget, use of economics. Right? Then they used press for their propaganda, using press for propaganda. And they wanted to educate people. They wanted, the purpose was, method was to educate even here and the even British people. They established some institution right outside India to educate people. They wanted to educate, right, both Indian and British public opinion, both Indian and British public opinion. And they had firm faith, they had faith in British sense of equity, justice and fair play. They had faith in British sense of equity, justice and fair play. Equity, justice and fair play. Fine. So this is important. Then only we can understand the nature of these moderates. So you will realize that when you will see this method of their functioning, you will realize their weakness, right? So what was the weakness of these early nationalists, if you can call them moderates? What was the weakness? I told you they had faith, firm faith in British sense of justice. So first weakness of these early nationalists was they failed to realize the true nature, they failed to realize the true nature of British rule. True nature of British rule. This was the biggest problem. They failed to realize the true nature of British rule. They realized that they are good people. Once you will present your views before them, they would be reacting, they would be doing something. So they had poor comprehension, poor, you can say, idea about the real nature of the colonial rule. So they failed to realize the true nature of British rule. So that weakness you can understand. Second weakness, you can easily see that second weakness was they had narrow social base. Why? Why we are saying this? Why narrow base? Because it was mainly a middle class approach, right? So they represented mainly middle class, educated class, right? So second weakness was middle class base, and they failed to acquire roots of, you can say, among masses. So no mass, you can say, connection. So they failed to acquire roots. Fine. So narrow base, no mass support, right, represented by middle class. And then one more weakness was that their organization was new, they lacked funds also. So these weaknesses also they had, right, weaknesses also they had. So, now you have two important development. One, what was their style of functioning, what was their method, what was their understanding, and what was the weakness of Indian National Congress or the early leaders of the Indian National Congress, which we call moderates. Fine. Now, on that basis, what is your understanding, what is your conclusion, that these moderates contributed something, or they failed in their effort? Evaluation, right, evaluation, what you can say? Evaluation, what we can say, that they failed or they contributed, right? They failed or they contributed. So, most of the scholar, particularly the extremist leader, they say that they failed, and therefore there was a rise of extremism. So, early nationalists failed, therefore there was a rise of nationalism. Can we say this? Can we say that because of these weaknesses of the moderates they failed? Can we say this? Failed? Can we say this? What do you think? They failed? No, we will never write this that they failed. We have to appreciate their contribution in the context of the prevailing circumstances. Fine. So, when you are writing about their evaluation, you can mention their contribution, their contribution, their contribution, right. What all we can mention their contribution? Number one, their economic contribution, right. You can give example of Dada Bhai Naroji and his drain theory. You can give example of R.C. Dutt, a great economic historian, R.C. Dutt and others, who exposed the true nature of colonial rule, So, they contributed in economic nationalism, right. So, economic contribution, we can write that how they linked Indian poverty to colonialism, how they linked Indian poverty to colonialism. We can also mention that how they compelled the government to form a commission on Indian expenditure, how they compelled the government to form a commission on Indian expenditure called Welby Commission. Fine. So, you can mention their economic contribution. It would be very important contribution, Moderates, early nationalists, they are known for their economic nationalism. Fine. Then, second contribution we can mention their contribution towards constitutional, you can say reform, constitutional demands, their constitutional demands, at least they demanded something. So, we can add that they wanted to broaden Indian participation in legislature. Early nationalist or moderates wanted to broaden Indian participation in legislature. They wanted to broaden Indian participation in legislature, right. They believed that budget should be referred to legislature, right. Right. They highlighted the famous statement of American Revolution. Moderates highlighted the famous statement of American Revolution, no taxation without representation, no taxation without representation. So they demanded representation, and government introduced 1892 Reform Act, 1892 Reform Act, 1892 Reform Act. So this was their biggest contribution. Of course 1892 Act was not, you can say, very effective act. Indians were not happy with this kind of act, but something, right, some progress made. So constitutional demands and 1892 Reform Act, you can consider it as a, you can say, their contribution. Then third, their contribution in the context of administrative reform, administrative reform. Their contribution in the context of administrative reform. And we can add that they demanded Indianization of services, Indianization of services. They demanded Indianization of services and simultaneous examination, right, both in India and England. Simultaneous examination both in India and England. So they demanded administrative reform, right, and some some civil services reform commission was also constituted. So we can consider that they contributed in demanding this administrative reform. Considered it as a, right, as their contribution. Then the fourth, their military demands, demands related to military, their military reform, demands related to military reforms, and these reforms related to reduction of, right, military expenditure. They demanded reduction of military expenditure, expenditure on army, and if they want to do it, no problem, but it should be shared by the British government. Why this burden on Indians? Expenditure of war, expenditure on military, why, right, burden on Indians? It should be evenly shared by the British government. So this kind of demand they made, right. Then they also talked about some civil rights. They also demanded some civil rights. They talked about right to speech. Moderates or early nationalists talked about right to speech, right to free press, right to speech, right to free press, right to form association, right to form association. Then they also demanded racial equality. They also demanded racial equality. Fine. So these kind of demand, military reforms, administrative reform, constitutional reform, right, economic improvement, this kind of demand they made. And then how can we forget them in the context of what? Fostering what you call the spirit of togetherness. So they contributed in, you can say, in that context. So they fostered, right, the spirit of togetherness. They fostered the spirit of togetherness. They helped in our nationalism. They helped in our nationalism. I hope you are getting that. We will never accept that they failed. We will highlight these contribution of early nationalists or moderates, and whenever we are concluding their contribution, early nationalist, we can mention that their contribution should be conceived in the light of prevailing political circumstances and colonial condition. I hope you are getting it. We must mention that they build, you can say, they developed a political platform which became a center of, right, you can say, nationalism. They developed, they preserved that platform, and a large number of workers, they started joining, right? They started joining our national movement because of these people. They educated them. So, in that context, their contribution is very important, and try to understand it and always remember it. The reaction of the British government towards them will suggest you that they contributed a lot. What was the reaction? When you will highlight that, when you will understand that, you will come to know that, right, they contributed. Reaction of British government towards this early nationalist, towards this early Congress. What was the reaction? You know what was the reaction? Initially, they considered them, right, suppose, right, you know that from 1885, right, till you can say 1887, first 2-3 years, they, right, they remained neutral. British remained neutral. They realized that they are just an organization of middle class babus, right? They will do nothing. So, they were neutral. After 1887, they started condemning them. They started condemning them. Why they started condemning them? Because there was rise of nationalism. Try to understand it. So, after 1887, British, they started condemning them. They started boycotting. There was a, right, order given by the government servant that you cannot attend this session. And after 1904, right, you will see that now Lord Curzon started saying that my purpose, right, is peaceful death, peaceful demise of this institution. Why you want peaceful death of this organization when they are not effective? Politics, right? They built a political platform, right? So, we can always mention that this time, this period was a very early nationalist contributed. And whenever you are analyzing, of course, there was no concrete demand. Why no concrete demand? Why no concrete result? Because the prevailing circumstances. But they made a decisive shift. They made a decisive shift in Indian politics, right? They built a political platform, right? So, we can always mention that this time, this period was a very important period for our nationalism. They preserved our nationalism. And you can always explain the role of early nationalists in the context of the attitude of British towards Congress. Fine. So, early nationalists played important role. There was some limitation, and because of those limitations, you will see that there was a rise of a new kind of nationalism which we can call extremism. So, moderate, and after that extremism.